Hello, and welcome to the Swiss Asset Management Talk podcast, presented by WHVP. WHVP has been helping Americans move assets offshore for over 30 years. This podcast is intended to help Americans learn about the various subjects that relate to offshore investing and investing outside of the U.S. market and the U.S. dollar. Now, let's get into it. Welcome, listeners, back to the Swiss Asset Management Talk podcast. We're really looking forward to today's podcast, where we finally get to have our first in-person interview with Jessica Schaedler of Capital Trustees. We're excited to really dive into a topic that we think is going to be quite interesting for our listeners. But before we get into that, Jessica, maybe you could introduce yourself, who you are, what you do with Capital Trustees, and also maybe just kind of like what you like to do in your free time.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks. I'm originally from Liechtenstein. I've been living in Switzerland, respectively in Zurich, for quite a long time. I came to Zurich for the first time in 23. In between, I have been studying in Vienna, something completely unrelated to what I'm doing now, which is social and cultural anthropology, but I still think it helps me a lot in my current job. I came back to Zurich, spent some time in Luxembourg, where I actually started working in the field that I am working in now, respectively related. I did a lot of corporate structuring in Luxembourg. I worked for a Swiss private bank, respectively the private office there. I spent time in Malta, I spent time in Geneva, in Zurich. I finally came back to be based in Zurich, now since 2015. And since then, basically, I'm really dedicated to the trust business. I started with Capital Trustees just recently, in January, where I'm the leading trust advisor, member of the executive committee, and some words to Capital Trustees. We're a Swiss trustee. We exclusively focus on trust services, meaning we don't do ancillary services like asset management. We have been recently licensed as a trustee. I think we're going to talk about that a little bit more later. Yeah. To my person, as I said, I moved around a bit in my years. Privately, I think I'm probably a little bit a nerdy person. I just love books. I love binge watching Netflix, weird stuff. And of course, I also love to go out, meet friends, have walks in nature, do some sports, typical stuff.
Awesome. It's wonderful to hear. I mean, I'm also traveling all over the place, and meeting other people like that is also fascinating. As you were mentioning about just being Capital Trustees getting the license from FINMA, that's what we're going to start this podcast off with today. With Jamie, maybe you can break some news that's already kind of been broken, but break the news about what we just found out last week.
Absolutely, yeah. Last week we finally got the confirmation of the conversation that we have been licensed by the Swiss Financial Market Authority, FINMA, which is a huge step for us. It's the first time that we as a company are legislated on like a national level. Before it was all organized through self-regulatory organizations, so the law has changed a few years ago, and for the past 10 months, we as a team, but especially Daniel Koller, who's our head of legal and compliance, have put in a lot of time and effort to make sure that we get this seal of approval from the Swiss Financial Market Authority. So we're now not only licensed with the SEC in the US, but we're also licensed here in Switzerland, and I think this is it's a great sign for us to continue the growth of our company, and we are very excited that the hard work we put in has finally paid off.
Congrats.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And speaking of congrats, over lunch today you shared the news that your company has been licensed as well, because it's not just the Swiss asset managers, it's also the trustees. Maybe you can also talk a little bit about how the process was for you.
Absolutely, yeah. So the process, it was more cumbersome than anyone would have expected. I think many trustees expected the licensing process to be mostly a papering exercise. However, I think reality showed that FINMA actually do require a deep dive into the business, into the processes, into the setup of the business. And so it was really a deep dive. It was cumbersome. Many trustees had to rearrange structures, rearrange process guidelines, or even introduce guidelines. It seems like we have been working towards that goal, knowing about the upcoming licensing requirements, being a relatively compact trustee company, we were well prepared. So I think for us the process was not so cumbersome, burdensome, because we had been prepared. Now, judging from the figures, I think many trustees probably underestimated it.
Yeah.
Probably was the same for the asset managers.
Yeah.
Because half or more than half, they did not even file for a license.
Oh wow, yeah, it was not as drastic with the asset managers, but I think that the point that you say about being well prepared, I think that also applies to us, because we have already done this licensing process over 10 years ago for the SEC. We already had a lot of the procedures in place that we needed for the license, so a lot of times we just had to like translate the documents and processes that we already had, which made it a bit easier, but it was still a lot of work. And as you say with the numbers, I mean, before this whole process started, we had between 2,300 and 2,500 independent asset managers in Switzerland. And so far, only a few hundreds have received the license. Of course, a lot of them are also still in the process, but the estimates currently say that probably only between 1,300 and 1,500 will actually get the license. So there has been a consolidation in the industry. There has been some complaints about that. I mean, it depends who you ask, whether people are happy about it or not. It is what it is. We can't change it now. And I think for companies that were able to successfully go through this process, it probably is a benefit, because it's going to strengthen even more the reputation of the Swiss Financial Center. And it also, I think, has led to a lot of older people just retiring, which is also not necessarily a bad thing, because I think it will rejuvenate rejuvenate, thank you, Jess. Rejuvenate the industry a little bit.
Yeah,
and what I think is also positive, because we had this transition period for 2 or 3 years now, where there was a lot of hesitancy of like founding new companies. So there has not really been a lot of new businesses starting. And now that this transition period has ended, I think a lot of companies are gonna start again as independent asset managers, just bringing some new blood and new ideas into the industry. So I think it is good that the process is over now, and I'm fairly optimistic, and I'm confident that we will have quite a bright future ahead of ourselves in terms of our industry.
Sure of that. I just, maybe one thing to share that I find quite interesting. So there were about 390 trustee companies in Switzerland who announced they would file to get the FINMA license. Out of those, 162 actually filed. The remaining 160 something, we don't know. Probably they are looking to get consolidated, absorbed by some others. And as of today, to my current knowledge, there are 34 trustees who have got the license at this stage. Now imagine, I mean, the numbers of the asset managers are quite impressive. I think our number is quite impressive too, but in
I mean, it speaks to your company. I mean, you have clearly been one of the early movers, and it shows that you are set up very well to succeed in today's complex world.
And of course, it's important that many more trustees will get the license, because we don't always only have to think for ourselves. It's also the strengthening of Switzerland as a financial center, for the reputation of our country as an international service provider, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think those are fantastic points about how Switzerland is able to adapt, and companies are able to adapt to changing regulations wherever they go. So on that, we're going to transition into our topic for today, which a while back there was a proposal to the Swiss government about a beneficial owner registry. So maybe, Jessica, you could kind of give us a rundown of what that proposal is and where it's kind of, I guess, sitting in the Swiss legal system.
So probably our audience has heard about beneficial ownership registers being implemented all around the world in various jurisdictions. All of that is founded by OECD's and FATF's pressure on countries to enhance their strategies to combat money laundering and terrorist financing. The European Union has been quite at the forefront there. They even overdid many countries, or respectively the European Union in general, by under the 4th Anti-Money Laundering Directive. They asked member countries to introduce registers of beneficial owners, to which registers access had to be granted to persons showing a legitimate interest into knowing who the beneficial owners of European resident companies were. Now, it was always a debate, what is a legitimate interest? That's very academic, I won't go into that today. Under the fifth anti-money laundering directive, it was widened, the scope of that, so that the European countries were asked, or European Union countries, member states were asked to free and open up public access to those information. European Union founded that on OECD and FATF pressure. However, according to FATF, the 40 recommendations of the FATF, being quasi the basis for the legislation, they do not demand public access, right? So recommendation 24, which speaks about beneficial ownership registers, being a recommendation from the FATF to countries worldwide, does not mention that beneficial ownership registers have to be public. I think that's an important point to note, right? So any country who has a public access even goes beyond what FATF recommends, right? FATF, they do regular reviews of countries, whether or not those countries are compliant with the recommendations introduced by FATF. And the last review of Switzerland revealed that Switzerland is mostly compliant with the 40 recommendations, except for recommendation 24, which is the one about beneficial ownership registers, where Switzerland is only partially compliant. Now, the current situation under the current law in Switzerland is that each company must, mandatory by law, have its own register of beneficial owners, but the company does not have to share that register with anyone. It's basically the company directors who have to keep that register, and if an authority has to get information, they may access it by asking the directors, can you please give me access to your beneficial ownership register? Now, FATF and also the Global Forum, who also gave recommendations to Switzerland, said, well, it's not exactly in line with what FATF and the OECD want, because actually what we want, dear Switzerland, is a central register where authorities have access and they know it's not, they don't have to approach each company separately. There is a central register that has this information available for the relevant authorities within Switzerland, but also authorities of other countries under mutual assistance agreements. So what happened then is that the Federal Council looked at the FATF Swiss Review Report 2020, it was issued, and they also looked at the Global Forum recommendations given to Switzerland, and they considered that it is necessary for Switzerland to follow suit with other countries, but it is also very clear that Switzerland wants to take, let's say, a typical Swiss approach, which is don't overdo it, don't go beyond what is asked and required. Especially, it seems now a reasonable approach. Maybe I have to go a step back. So the Federal Council issued a report on what they considered, what they discussed, and what they will do following up on the recommendations received. So what they will do is that they mandated the Federal Department of Finance to draft a bill about the introduction and implementation of beneficial ownership registers in Switzerland. It has been made very clear that the beneficial ownership register in Switzerland is not going to be public, because that is also not what is demanded by the FATF. And that report of the Federal Council was issued before last November's Court of European Justice ruling, which actually ruled that public access to beneficial ownership registers was a severe interference with the individual right to privacy and protection of data. So the Swiss approach, again, will be one where we seek to have an efficient solution and an effective solution, meaning we will have a central register for companies being incorporated in Switzerland, but it will not be the information in that register that contains the information about the beneficial owners will not be publicly available. In other European countries immediately following the Court of Justice ruling last November, they suspended public access. And if we have time, I have a kind of a funny little story to share about that, because I happened to be at the European STEP conference in Luxembourg the day the Court of Justice issued and published the ruling that public access interferes with the fundamental right to individual data protection. So during the conference, they made an announcement, dear audience. It was like 100, 150, 200 experts from all over Europe, lawyers, trustees, etc. So they announced access to public register, Luxembourg and Netherlands, suspended. And everyone was like cheering, standing ovations, like, because in our industry, it's obviously a big topic, because you have to ask yourself, what's the balance? How much does it help jurisdictions and also tax enforcement, etc., to know everything about each and every beneficial owner in the combat of terrorist financing and anti-money laundering? You have to find a balance between the protection of the individual and the benefit it actually gives the society to combat or to reach a certain goal when it comes to anti-money laundering. So for us, it's an important achievement that we know that the data, or also the individual data, like name, even personal addresses in some countries are publicly available, which can be a very dangerous set of information available in certain countries or for certain people if they are rich, like we talk about bribery or even kidnapping, etc. Yeah. So for sure that won't even be a debate in Switzerland.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. And maybe Jamie, and we can come back to you, Jessica, as well, but kind of, this is just a proposed bill at the moment. It's not even been brought before the Bundesrat or the Congress.
It's still in drafting period. Correct. Until end of June. Yeah. The first draft might be available.
And so maybe Jamie, you can talk and share your thoughts on kind of from the asset management side of what that kind of means for the industry. And then maybe afterwards, Jessica, you can go in as far as a trustee and what that kind of means.
Absolutely. I'm very happy to do that. Just maybe quickly, a very short step back. Can you elaborate for our audience what FATF means and what OECD means?
Oh, yeah.
I just want to make sure that we don't lose anyone. So for us, it's very daily acronyms, but it might not be for someone who's outside our industry. So maybe just like a sentence to each, who they are and why are they pushing for this.
So the FATF is the Financial Action Task Force, and their goal is to help countries in the fight against money laundering and terrorist financing. The OECD, honestly, I don't remember. It's Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, exactly. And as far as I know, FATF and OECD, they work closely together. They are tied up. They are together in that worldwide fight against money laundering and terrorist financing.
Great, thank you so much. So for our perspective, I assume that we will probably see it very similarly, because as financial professionals, it's very important for me, and I think also for like Switzerland as a country, to not be a place for like that attracts criminals and that attracts people that want to finance terrorism or launder money. I mean, we have no interest in attracting those kinds of people. Certainly. But at the same time, there's very reasonable desires for privacy protection. And that's something that, as you said, sometimes privacy protection can be, if it is not there, it can be a risk to your life or to the life of your loved ones, depending on which jurisdiction you reside in. And there's so many good reasons to protect your private information. I think Europe and Switzerland especially value privacy protection very highly, which is also why we as jurisdictions are often sought out from other countries, from people from other countries to work together with. So as you said, as you put it very nicely, we have to balance those different goals of being a good place to do business, being a compliant place to do business, because if Switzerland gets on a blacklist, that's not going to help anyone either, right? That's going to be problematic for us as companies, also for our end clients. So we want to comply with international standards, but also we don't want to overshoot. So I think Switzerland's approach, we have a direct democracy, everyone gets to have a say. Oftentimes it takes a little bit longer to take a decision compared to other countries, but that doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, because once we put a law into place, it usually is very much thought through. All the stakeholders get to say their piece on it. Everyone gets to have an opinion. If we don't like it as a population, we can vote on it. So I think Switzerland's slow approach is quite sustainable. It's good because we don't want to be the first movers. We want to make sure that we see what works, what doesn't work. As we saw, like with the developments in Europe, I mean, if you're too quick in doing something and then it doesn't work out, you have to take a few steps back. That's also not great. So I think Switzerland is doing the best as it can in terms of complying, while at the same time really just doing the bare minimum to comply, to make sure that we don't have any illegal activities here, and at the same time still prioritizing the privacy needs of our clients. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I absolutely agree with you. I also think that we will have to see how in practice it works. From a trustee point of view, what I can say is that it will be a register of companies, of beneficial owner of companies. So trustees will not be directly affected by it, for the simple reason that a trust is not a company, it's not a legal entity, plus there is no Swiss trust. So the trustees will not have any obligations under the new law, except if a trust managed by a Swiss trustee, or any other trustee for that matter, owns a Swiss company. The trustee will have to notify the company directors of who the beneficial owners of the trust will be.
But to clarify, if a trust opens up a bank account in Switzerland, irrespective of whether the trustee is a Swiss trustee or an American trustee, wherever they're at,
correct,
the beneficial owners would still have to be in this central register, correct?
No, because there we talk about the anti-money laundering provisions.
Okay.
The new law, the draft bill that is going to be drafted about the central register of beneficial owners of Swiss companies,
Okay.
that is something separate from that. So all the duties that we have, be it trustees, be it banks, in identifying beneficial owners remain exactly the same. What changes is, under the current law, the companies have to keep this internal register of beneficial owners. Now that internal company-held beneficial owner register will be somehow put into a central register.
Mm-hmm. So in the sense of it's covering the companies, well, Swiss-based companies.
Correct.
So if, as an example, a LLC from the United States would like to open up a Swiss bank account, they wouldn't necessarily be on that list because it's an LLC in the U.S.
Correct.
Yeah.
It's
But
about
the US
Swiss
is also
companies.
working on a BO registry,
Correct.
right? So
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah, so
actually from 1st of January, but also it won't be publicly accessible.
Yeah. No, it's very interesting to hear. I mean, I think as Americans, as American myself, and the Americans I speak with in my family and friends, you know, when they talk about privacy, that's one of the interesting things, or their ears perk up when they hear about Swiss banking. Mm-hmm. You know, you have the wrong stereotype that there's somehow any kind of criminal activity involved, which is not the case.
Not at all.
You know, moving to Switzerland, working with a Swiss trustee or an asset manager is totally legal, and there's provisions all around it to ensure that the Americans are on solid legal ground in what they're doing. Absolutely.
Switzerland is regulated from all points of view.
Correct. Yeah, and so the idea of hearing a beneficial registry, they think, oh, but then I have to sign up for that as someone coming out. And so being able to understand what that means for them coming from an outside jurisdiction is very important to hear, and that's why we're talking about it today, so that we can really provide that information for Americans and people looking to use Swiss services to understand what that is. Yeah. And so that's quite interesting. And maybe you guys, one thing you both talked about, the bill being put forth to the government. And Jamie, you had mentioned how there's direct democracy. Part of the reason the Swiss government moves so slowly in implementing regulations and new laws is that eventually, if the population is going to have to vote on it. and so they can't do things too fast or too slow. They have to make sure that it's very well thought out and proposed to the public of what it is. And I guess that would be my question to both of you as Swiss citizens. What is kind of your feeling on this bill as it moves forward? We're still obviously before even the proposal, but what is your thoughts on it, I guess, as Swiss people? Where do you kind of stand in, I guess, your emotions or your feelings about this proposed bill?
Well, I mean, personally, I'm not a huge fan of over-regulation, right? So I think we had a very long period of time where there was almost no regulation, and I don't think that was great. And then we had a period of time where we catched up and we're like, okay, we need to regulate it somehow because a lot of shady things could be going on if there's no rules. But now I feel like we're moving in an era where there's not necessarily any benefit there. It's just more paperwork. There's going to be more cost. It's going to be more complex for clients. And oftentimes clients, they don't really understand what their rights are, what the changes are, and then they just sign away what people put in front of them. So I'm not really sure if those regulations are going to actually be protecting more people, if it's actually going to reduce money laundering, because Switzerland is already highly regulated. I don't think there's going to be any terrorism financing going through Switzerland, and certainly not at like a large scale. Same with money laundering. So personally, I'm not a fan. I think all the additional rules and regulations that are coming up are just going to put on more administrative work on our end, that we then have less time to actually cater towards our clients. That's a very personal opinion. Again, there's a lot of different stakeholders involved. I understand that that's just globally the direction that the world is going to take. I personally will probably not be able to put a stop to it, but where we can as a company, we're involved with like the National Association for Asset Managers, where we try to put our interests out there, explain our point of view, and that's what we can do. That's what we do. We work very hard in making sure that the Swiss Financial Center is going to stay as popular and as well running as it is currently. But at the end of the day, if things get implemented, we will have to deal with that as we have for the past 10 years or so.
Jessica, maybe you could share your thoughts then.
Yeah, so I have two personas now talking. My personal persona, I so fully agree with you. I also think it's not necessary. We're highly regulated. We have the common reporting standard. We have the DAX 6. We have the automatic exchange of information all around the world. So it's just adding up to the list of duties with no clear benefit. It has never been proven with figures and facts that beneficial ownership registers do anything in the fight against money laundering. There's a lot to read about that. Never anyone could prove it, that it actually does something. So I think it's probably, as you say, it's like just adding burden and paperwork for us. On the other hand, for Switzerland as a financial place, I think we are already highly regulated. We have no interest in being seen as the one who always goes against the rest. So, and given that it won't be a public register, meaning that not anyone can just come and ask access. It will not even be open to persons showing a legitimate interest, because in many countries, legitimate interest even applies to journalists, investigative journalists, who obviously have an interest in selling fancy articles about I don't know what. Yeah. So that won't be the case in Switzerland. So for our clients, even if we have this central register of beneficial ownership register, put it bluntly, it won't do any harm to our clients. The authorities can access the information already now if they need to, just that it will be centrally available now, not to the public again. And for the industry, for the asset managers, for the trustees, for the entire financial industry, from us, from Switzerland, it will be a sign towards the world. We're fully compliant. Clients, we comply with all the regulations that OECD, FATF, other states put on us, put on everyone. I think for the financial place, it might be a good sign from Switzerland that we want to cooperate, we want to comply, even though we don't necessarily share the opinion that it actually helps in the very important fight against money laundering and terrorist financing.
Yeah, I think those are very good points, and I would like to ask either of you if you have any final thoughts or a message you would like to, I guess, or key point, I guess, you would like to explain to the clients or the listeners about this proposed bill.
I think my final word would be that it's not as bad as it might sound on like the first instance, because people, when they hear BO registry, I think the first mode is like panic. But if we look at how Switzerland's going to implement it, I don't think it is as bad as it might seem. And I think that was also a little bit the goal of this conversation, to just show the different nuances and show how Switzerland might be implementing it differently than the US, differently than Europe, how we still value privacy protection very highly, and to just take a breath and maybe wait for the final result, see what comes out, and then again, like the Swiss population will have the last say in it. If we don't like it, we can order a vote on it. So
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's also not entirely clear who will actually exactly be a beneficial owner. So like the draft bill will have some surprises for us, I think. Maybe it would be interesting to catch up in half a year from now, once we have seen the bill.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I would also say like Swiss clients bringing their money into Switzerland, they don't have to be concerned, because Switzerland's approach will in any case be an efficient and an easy one. We don't overdo it with regulations. So I think compared to having a Luxembourg company, for example, or a Netherlandish company, having a Swiss company will still be much more interesting from various angles for international clients.
Cool. Thank you, Jessica, for sharing your expertise and joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure. Jamie, as always, thank you for being here. And if our listeners are interested to learn more about Jessica or Capital Trustees, all of her information will be in the show notes. Whether you're listening to this by audio or on YouTube, you can find some links to her and Swiss Trustees. So thanks, guys, and really, really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. Jess. Thank you. Thanks again for joining us on this episode of the Swiss Asset Management Talk podcast. If you would like to learn more about WHVP, check out our webpage at whvp.ch. Or check us out at any of our social media handles at LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube by simply searching WHVP. Have a fantastic rest of your day.